What explains the superb level of organization that practically blind, speechless ants possess, or the seemingly rehearsed aerial acrobatics that flocks of birds display? It's the same term that describes the relationship between cells and organs, or organs and organisms. It's a philosophic term, emergence. In biology, the word is used a bit carelessly, without much heed for the definition. It is used in place of arise or arises from, not necessarily incorrect, but not doing justice to the term's complexity either. In this video, I will release emergence from some of its ambiguity and give examples of phenomena where the concept applies quite well. But firstly, a brief history of emergence. The term emergence was first commonly used in social, philosophic, and scientific settings during the 18th and 19th centuries. The concept was employed to answer, in mechanistic terms, the question, what is life? Emergentists were keen to avoid explanations that relied on any sort of vitalism, the belief that some vital force ran through and controlled the natural world. This is what British philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote in 1843, the first complete instance of emergence in science. To whatever degree we might imagine our knowledge of the properties of the several ingredients of a living body to be extended and perfect, it is certain that no mere summing up of the separate action of those elements will ever amount to the action of the living body itself. An emergent property, to be more general than Mill, is one had by an object, but not by that object's fundamental parts. Take the nervous system, for example. It is made up of countless neurons and synapses. None of these neurons individually are more than a cell, but when the system is considered as a whole, you get something much greater than any individual cell. You get conscious life. Emergence shows itself in more than just organisms. It can describe the relationship between life and systems like populations, communities, an ecosystem, or the entire biosphere. It describes phenomena like swarm intelligence, one of the most ideal and commonly used examples of emergence. Swarm intelligence is the collective behavior of a group of animals, especially social insects. One of the foremost instances of swarm intelligence in nature are ant colonies and the organization that they exhibit. If you place one ant on the ground, it will wander aimlessly. 100 would just be a chaotic mess. 1,000, though, 1,000,000, something very different will happen. They suddenly become organized, productive, directed. To understand why this happens, we must establish what motivates ants. Food. Okay, that done, let's set the stage. There is a dozen or so very good ant food sources in an area. The first generation of ants wander about aimlessly for a while. Swarm intelligence doesn't magically increase the intellect of each ant, and eventually they stumble into a few of these sources, leaving behind them pheromone trails as they return to their colony with their gathered resource. As the productivity of these routes increases their popularity, the pheromone trails grow thicker from the many passes, and the ants more likely to follow them to the best food. What arises is an immensely efficient food transporting system, powered by a superintelligence that generation after generation of ant will participate in and benefit from. The problem I see is that when applying the swarm intelligence phenomena to the definition of emergence I gave earlier, there is a certain lack of satisfaction. While it is true that the collective intelligence of the colony is a property that is greater than the individual intelligence of an ant, it is not quite as convincing as our earlier consciousness example. The solution to this issue? Well, it lies in further refining our understanding of emergence by delving into its two forms, strong emergence and weak emergence. The two premises of strong emergence are a somewhat more constraining, but basically analogous form of the general definition of emergence I gave earlier. Strong emergence is defined as a property or substance that arises out of more fundamental properties or substances, and thus depends on those latter properties or substances. And b, a property or substance that is novel or irreducible, and thus in a certain sense independent from the more fundamental properties or substances. In other words, something is strongly emergent when its existence depends on the parts it's made of, yet it has new characteristics that hold some sort of power over and cannot be explained entirely by the lower level parts. This irreducibility premise found in strong emergence leads to the dismissal of the idea in most scientific studies. How can something's existence, swarm intelligence for example, be dependent upon the colony of ants that it arises from, yet be greater than and have power over them? Strong emergence is too much like magic. Currently there are no known instances of it in biology, and as our understanding of the universe is increasing, I doubt that will change. For comprehension's sake, here's an example. It's a philosophic example, but it does appear to be strong emergence. All thinking entities affect the world in an intentional way. An animal's wants and needs drive it to seek out those wants and needs, be it food, shelter, etc. These desires are mental expressions. The mental arises from the physical, but when the animal tries to fulfill these desires, for instance, eating a plant, the mental becomes a direct cause of physical change. This example works off the assumption that the mental is not entirely reducible to the physical, but is still only existent because of it. A summary of strong emergence tells us that it defines an emergent phenomena as 1. Dependent on lower-level properties or substances, 2. Irreducible to those lower-level properties or substances, and 3. Exerting some control over its constituent properties or substances. This renders it quite unlike its counterpart, weak emergence, a concept that actually has a place in scientific study. The two hallmarks of weak emergence are C. Emergent properties are somehow constituted by and generated from underlying processes. D. Emergent properties are somehow unpredictable based on knowledge of their underlying processes. Weak emergence replaces the irreducible notion in strong emergence with the idea that the causal relation between emergent properties and their fundamental parts is not understandable only given knowledge of those fundamental parts. David Chalmers, a professor of philosophy at New York University, writes this, clarifying our hallmarks C and D. A high-level property is weakly emergent with respect to a low-level domain if the high-level property arises from the low-level domain, but truths concerning that property are unexpected or surprising, given the principles governing the low-level domain. Basically, to define something as weakly emergent, the phenomena has only to be surprising or unexpected given knowledge of its constituent parts, not irreducible. This definition makes it easy enough to imagine an example. Returning to the nervous system and the brain in particular, we see a seemingly random organization of cells that happens to produce the phenomena that is conscious life. And if we forget for a moment every instance, every meeting with a living creature we have had that makes this notion seem typical, we find that the intelligence this clump of nerves produces is truly quite astonishing. This leads us to the two distinctions of theoretical and inductive predictability. Theoretical predictability is the ability to predict something through knowledge of a lower-level property, and inductive predictability the ability to predict something through experience with it. With that, we have defined weak emergence. It is a phenomenon that is reliant on the emergent property's constituent parts, and that is theoretically unpredictable given knowledge only of those parts. The following examples will exhibit weak emergence and its applications in biology. Flocking. Many animals do it in some form or another, but we mainly attribute it to birds. It's quite an interesting phenomenon to watch, and it's a prime example of weak emergence. C is clearly fulfilled, for a flock is made of individual birds. Then there is D. A scientist could study a single bird for as long as she wished, but without seeing it interact with other birds, would be incapable of theoretically predicting the phenomena of flocking. Now, the rules that flocking creatures tend to follow are well established. 1. They avoid crowding neighbors. 2. They steer towards average heading of neighbors. 3. They steer towards average position of neighbors. But these have only been discovered through observation of the whole. Flocking is only inductively predictable, and therefore weakly emergent. Returning to the ants for a moment, I said the classification of emergence wasn't satisfactory due to the unconvincingness of the example in light of only the basic definition of emergent. Knowing what we do now about weak emergence, I think it worth reevaluating. The basic definition I gave was that an emergent property is one had by an object, but not by that object's fundamental parts. It is completely true that ants don't exhibit swarm intelligence behavior individually, but all the traits needed to exhibit the phenomena, when that single ant is added to a colony, are there. Looking at the issue with our knowledge of weak emergence and theoretical predictability, I think there is a much more satisfying conclusion. C is fulfilled, and D is fulfilled because the phenomena is only understandable at the colony level. Swarm intelligence is weakly emergent. Emergence is everywhere. The body you occupy emerges from a collection of organs, those organs from cells, those cells from organelles, then molecules, then atoms. Going up, human society emerges from you and every person on this planet. Emergence is important in science because it helps us recognize relationships we don't understand and maybe never will. It helps us gain perspective on the world and see that the mitochondria in a cell from a fly and the entire biosphere are in fact connected. Most importantly, it helps us understand the complexity that all forms of life exhibit, be it in the vast diversity of animals or the patterned petals of a single flower.